My name's Wayne from InTimeWithMusic. This is going to be a series of short videos on an analog electronic drum from the 80s. As a matter of fact, it was one of the first drum sets made that actually had electronic cymbals as well. And it was endorsed by Mike Baird and Jim Keltner, two of the most famous session drummers. Some of the musicians they played with were John Lennon, George Harrison, the Bee Gees, Bob Dylan, everybody. And anyway, the Pearl Drum Company made this set and hired them to endorse it. The set was originally manufactured as a drum practice set. It evolved into more than that. It was on the at the very edge of the electronic drum business, far before Simmons or any of the digital drum manufacturers like Alesis and Roland came into play. These drums were designed and produced in 1984, and they were quickly discontinued in 1985. And that was partly due to the cost. It was an expensive set. It came with a bass drum holder, a pad. It came with two toms. It came with a floor tom and a snare drum, cables, and a pair of hi-hat cymbals that were electronic, a ride cymbal and a crash cymbal. And I believe that sold in Canada, retailed for around $1,400 in 1984. What was very revolutionary about them was the fact that a drummer could actually play an entire drum set with headphones, and you could tap in your cassette player or your audio source and hear that in the headphones, and also the brain had a built-in metronome. This is the brain here. I'm in the process of refurbishing this set, so it's totally untested. The brain, just to run over it a little bit, has a metronome built in here with a volume control so that you can control the levels in your headphones. Tempo control, of course, for a metronome. Has an LED here that would flash in time with the quarter note beat. There's a line-in control on here to allow your sound source level to be mixed in with the drums level. Master volume for the drums. And then each instrument, floor tom, tom-tom, tom-tom, bass drum, snare drum, ride cymbal, crash cymbal, hi-hat cymbal, cymbals, had its own set of mixes. And they were different for the cymbals as for the drums. The drums had a tone control for pitch, a sustain control for the amount of ring that would come out of the drum head, and a sensitivity control for the pads. The cymbals were limited to a level control for the cymbals and sensitivity control. No pitch controls were available for the cymbals. Inputs, line out here for tapping into a PA system or external amplifier. If you did want to hear them without the headphones, line in for your tape deck or other sound source, and a separate cable for your cymbals and a separate cable for your drums. Now on this particular brain, these two jacks were changed out. They were originally RCAs, and they were changed into a DIN jack, which was a lot more durable and more practical. I haven't tested this at all. I'm just going to give everybody a quick look into the Pearl Fightman drums. I've seen internet comments on them, and it seems like the history is fairly vague. But again, they were released in '84, discontinued in 1985, and in 1985, when they were discontinued, I personally bought the rights to all of the Fightman drums that were left, all of the new sets that were left in the Pearl's warehouse in Canada. So I had the exclusive rights in 1985 for all of these drum sets that were sold. And I did that not so much to sell them. I did that actually to rent them out to music students that had trouble practicing. They were living in apartments or basement suites, young kids that couldn't play an open drum set. So they would come into our shop and I would rent them these sets. Now today, all I'm going to do is show you the drum pad triggers. And the reason that's important is Pearl didn't know that these sensors, these piezo sensors that are in the pads, were the same sensors that they would continue to use for years and years. This is a Roland replacement sensor here, and you can see that it's exactly the same as the Fightman sensor. This is a Fightman sensor out of a cymbal. That's why it's on this plastic plate. This is a Fightman sensor that's out of a drum pad like that. But they didn't change. And today, even in 2019, you can still use these pads to trigger modern day digital brains. The difference being is that these pads only have one central sensor. They don't have any edge sensors. They don't have anything that you can use to get a rim shot sound without modifying the pad itself. Over the years, what, 35 years, 34 years since these were released, I think I've owned 20 sets. And my background in electronics isn't extensive. And so that's one of the beauties of this particular set, and why I bought them in the first place, was because you can fix anything yourself, pretty much. So I thought this set somehow came back to the nest here. I'm going to fix it up, refurbish it, and then sell it. And I thought I might as well just make a bunch of short videos on what I'm doing, so that it might dispel some of the rumors out there. Unfortunately, over the 35 years, a lot of these drum sets have been dismantled and separated. The components have all gotten separated, and that's partly because some of the components are fragile, and the brain often went to a recording studio or an electronic music specialist, somebody like that, because the brain has incredible sounds. They're all generated with analog technology, not digital. But it's a shame, because again, this is, I'm not sure, but I believe this is the very first electronic drum set that was ever released that included all of the drums, the bass drum, and electronic cymbals. And the sounds are pretty amazing. And we'll get to those in the last video when I test the brain and assemble the set for you. But today, I'm just going to give you the Pearl Fightman 101. We're going to talk about the pads and the cymbals and the cables a little bit. So we're going to start with the pads. The tom pads and the bass drum pads were 8-inch, and the tom pad has one RCA connector, and the bass drum has 2 RCA connectors. That was so that once you installed your bass drum on its mount, you could run a jumper cable from the extra RCA to another 8-inch pad and get another mount and have double bass. That's all it is. Later on, and throughout the history, the second RCA was also used to trigger other sounds, sound effects, thunder sheets, timpani, gongs, whatever, and the bass drum would still function and send its signals to the brain. Now what we're going to do, all I'm going to do is show you how simple these are. Again, if I can fix them, anybody can fix them. So we're just going to dismantle it. It's an ordinary tension rod. I want to try to do this as quickly as possible. The beauty of this particular set is after 35 years, it still has all of its original heads. That's incredible. And that brings me to this. This is just a standard 8-inch 4-hole drum hoop. Nothing electronic about it. It's just an ordinary drum hoop. Same thing with this head. Possibly made by Remo for Pearl, I'm not sure. But this is the original head. Pearl Black Beat, they called it, made in Japan. So I guess it wasn't Remo if it was made in Japan. Anyway, that's the original Fightman head, and it's an ordinary drum head. As you can see, it's about an ambassador weight, single ply. The drum shell itself has a piece of foam under the batter area to give you some rebound and something that the head can stretch on and also suppress any sound, because that's obviously what we're trying not to get on this kit is acoustic sound. Underneath you have your piezo. You have one wire running to one RCA and a jumper cable running to the other RCA, so you can trigger something else. Now, this particular drum had been returned with a broken wire. So when it went into the shop, the technician resoldered the wire back onto the RCA, and then he put this caulking on here, silicone rubber, to prevent it from breaking off again. Because again, this is a bass drum, and it takes a lot of shock. You know, on that little stand on a kick pedal, you're going to get a lot of shock, and these little RCA sensors really weren't designed for the professional market. They're kind of like what you'd find on a home stereo. So anyway, that's a good idea. If anybody out there is having that problem, just beef it up with some silicone caulking, and you're good to go. So that's the bass drum. On the back has these felts on it, and that's just so that when this is installed over top, any vibration is absorbed by the felts. I'll get a little bit more on that here. This is the tom pad, and that's what you're going to hear acoustically. So you see those felt pads in there working pretty good. Let's pull this one apart. Faster, faster, faster. Okay, so the only difference between the tom-tom and the bass drum, same hoop, same head, same shell, same back, same felts, but only one RCA. And this one doesn't have the silicone because the toms didn't take the impact like the bass drums do. So this one here hasn't been covered with the silicone. You can see that ordinary RCA jack there. And this is the original piezo, tape still holding out after 35 years, sensor still firmly attached. Sometimes the sensors would fail or just literally come unglued, and that's an easy fix. Just glue it back on. If it fails, you just go and buy yourself a brand new sensor. Same thing, still make them today. And that's the whole thing about the drums. So let's get those out of the way. We'll come back to these when they're working. Now the cymbals. I've got a small work area here, so I'm going to show you the hi-hat cymbals. The Fightman drum set came with an 18-inch ride cymbal, an 18-inch crash cymbal. They were both identical. Each had one sensor. And the hi-hats come with a 14-inch top with a sensor on it and a 14-inch bottom. Now the way this all worked, some room here. The way this all worked was that the impact area had to be positioned in the same place all the time. And this just fits on a regular hi-hat stand with a regular pull rod. So the pull rod would come up through the center here, and the top cymbal would go up and down just like a regular hi-hat set of hi-hat cymbals. But the difference being is that on a regular hi-hat cymbals, regular cymbals can rotate and you can still play them. But on an electronic cymbal, it has to stay in a fixed position. So just take the impact pad off. These are just ordinary rubber pads that were put on with a contact cement that would dry out over the years. See, it's very common to see duct tape holding that on over the sensor area, which you can see the screws from the sensor bracket here. And these two screws up here, they hold a plate that adds weight to the cymbal. I'll get to that in a minute. This is a locator pin. Now how this works is that you want the sensor to stay in the impact area all the time while you're playing. The cymbal's going up and down, so the locator pin blends the two cymbals together. It keeps the top cymbal from moving horizontally away from the bottom cymbal. And that's important because of this micro switch that you see here. We'll get to in a second. So this is not an electronic component, this locator pin. It's just there to keep the top cymbal from moving away from the bottom cymbal. And there's the weight there on the bottom cymbal, and there's two weights on the top cymbal. And those two weights were important to keep the cymbals in the same playing position all the time. So you notice the impact area is here, the micro switch is here, and the weights are here. So that system would keep the cymbals in the playing area. It didn't matter if you were a right-handed drummer or a left-handed drummer. Once these were set, they wouldn't move. Now, the top cymbal has the locator pin, the weights, and it has this housing for the sensor. And this is really unusual to see the housing 35 years later in such good shape. I don't want to peel this up or anything because these are fairly brittle parts. I don't want to break it, so I'm just going to take these two housing screws off and let you see underneath here. And there you have it. This is just like brand new. There's your piezo on its mounting plate, held on by two posts. The wires run into the housing here for the RCA output. And sometimes these would break. So that's a real easy fix, is to either replace the piezo or to put the old piezo on a new piece of plastic. All that is a piece of plexiglass. Super easy. So that's the top. Now the bottom, okay, the top of course is where the cymbal is crashed, more or less, the crash sound. The bottom has this micro switch that also has an RCA output. Now, when the top cymbal comes down onto the bottom cymbal, it engages the micro switch, and what that does is it shuts off the cymbal sound. And that way it simulated the tss, 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 so that you could actually get a nice open hi-hat sound and then a choked closed hi-hat sound, because that micro switch would shut off the sound to the cymbals. Okay, so we'll take a look at the cymbal cables now. Like I said, there's two different cables. These are kind of like a snake. The separate wires for the cymbals and drums are on fairly fragile RCA cables that are blended together, terminating in this DIN plug that has been put on here. The cymbal cable has 4 RCA plugs. 2 of them are for the hi-hats. One is into the micro switch for the close hi-hat. One is into the cymbal sensor on the top for the open hi-hat sound. And how it gets there is it gets fed through this second hole. That's why there's a hole for the pull rod, and there's this second hole to get through the cymbal and reach the sensor. And of course the other one just plugs into the bottom for your closed hi-hat sound. Now, the drum cable has 5 instead of 4. So if you have a set of these drums, you need to have the 2 separate cables. You need to have one with 4 RCAs and one with 5 RCAs. This one here, you have your bass drum, your floor tom, your snare drum, your rack tom 1, your rack tom 2. Same thing as the cymbal cable, except there are 5 distinct lines for the sounds. So, easy to fix. If the RCA breaks, you can just put a new RCA on here. If the DIN doesn't work, if it fails, you can just put a new DIN plug on. All the parts are readily available. As far as the sensors go, yep, you can buy those. That's a Roland sensor. It'll work fine. Or you can buy any of the bulk piezo sensors that you can find online. And as far as the hi-hat goes, this is just a Radio Shack. Remember Radio Shack? I still have some Radio Shack parts. Remember those? Well, it's just a micro switch that looks like this. You just pop these 2 posts off. This comes off. You can take that micro switch out. It's screwed on. Piece of cake to fix that. So there's no excuse not to have these drum sets working. We're going to find out a little bit more on that in the next videos. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Wayne from InTimeWithMusic. I got a lot more to say about these drums. They're pretty amazing. And it's nice to see one come back after 35 years to get fixed up and sell it again.